Hey everybody, Brandon Marcello here once again for another episode of Social Distance on 24/7 Sports. Our guest is Dan Wolken, national columnist for USA Today. He's been around the college football game, college basketball for a long time, and has even expanded his horizons beyond that with the Olympics in recent years. Dan, thanks for joining us on Social Distance. We appreciate it. It's been a crazy few months, as we all know, unprecedented times for a lot of reasons. And as sports reporters, we find ourselves in a situation where obviously we're reporting on more than just sports and games and logistics behind things and trends. And you've obviously been in the center of that as a columnist and providing some of your opinions on all this. How obviously has this been maybe a little bit different? One with COVID-19, but also with the riots, the racial injustices we've seen and coming to the forefront, people's voices being heard. How has that kind of changed your approach and the way you do your job here in the last, few months?
Well, it's interesting because for the entire time I've been a sports writer, I've never been like a 9 to 5 job kind of guy. Like that's just not the way the business works. You are traveling, you're going weekends, you're going nights, you're at games. It's a crazy schedule. And yet ever since March, I've kind of been a 9 to 5, 9 to 6, kind of guy like everybody else at working from home. Now, obviously it's not exactly like that because there's things that have happened, at different hours and you got to jump on it in the news business. But generally speaking, I've been at home. Like I'm not traveling. This is the longest probably stretch I've been on without leaving town or getting on a plane or anything like that. Probably since I was in college. It's just crazy to not travel when that's what you're used to doing all the time. So there's that. And then also the difference in this story, I think, is that you're discovering and finding out concurrently with people who you typically rely on to give you information about what's going on. And oftentimes they don't know themselves what's going on, and they're sort of speculating and trying to figure it out just as you are. And you're almost sort of helping each other, just coming at it from different angles. And I've had debates, with people, with administrators about, testing procedures and things like that. And, it's just a very different kind of story to cover, but it's been challenging and I think an interesting way. And obviously I don't want this to go on forever, but it's been just professionally somewhat interesting because it's just unlike anything we've ever dealt with before.
Yeah, it's a different type of challenge, and it allows us to kind of broaden our viewpoints on things, but also gain some knowledge in the process. Because what we're seeing now is obviously a shift change just in college athletics with more power toward the players, and then also you're seeing now in reality, in the real world, more voices being heard concurrently with that is further strengthening the power of the players, as we're seeing even at Texas with them providing kind of a guidelines of this is what we want to see happen on our campus. And other students and student athletes across the country are doing similar things. I didn't think we'd see something happen this quickly, but I think it just goes to show you that because of the times we're in and everything kind of compacting together and it being the right time with name, image, likeness, and all this stuff going on with the NCAA on the conference level, we're seeing a sea change maybe a little bit more quickly and a little bit more aggressively happening now than we would have expected. I thought we might see some of this stuff in 5 years, and we're already talking about it maybe happening here the next 1 year.
Yeah, it's obviously a confluence of events that has led to a real moment. And, I think you can't discount the fact that college athletes are not on campus. They're typically, in these regimented routines, every single day, even in the off season. College football is like a 365-day-a-year job at this point. And so that doesn't necessarily lend itself to the type of, reflection or you're maybe a little bit worried about stepping out of line because everyone is, together and you're supposed to be together. Well, when everyone's apart, when everyone is, you're checking in on Zoom meetings and you're kind of independent in that way. Well, that you don't have the same sort of accountability to, the rules or whatever, and also just the severity of what happened, and the fact that it sparked this nationwide conversation and this movement. It's just a lot of different things I think that play into it, and yeah, that's why it was important to me when people kind of say, why are you so worried about what Dabo Sweeney says or what any of these coaches have to say about, social movements or protests? Why do we care about what they say? Well, the reason you care and the reason why it's important is because I think it's important for the players to know that their coach has their back, that they're not going to face consequences for speaking up, that, the coach is not going to discipline them or admonish them for speaking out or speaking up for what they believe in. So that's why it's important to me for the coaches to be on record in this.
Yeah. And how do you think that, I mean, we're kind of in the early days of all this, of coaches reacting and things coming up in the past, specifically, at Iowa, with Kirk Ferentz and his longtime strength coach, Chris Doyle, which seems probably going to drag out a little bit. But how do you feel coaches, and maybe even cite some specific coaches, are handling all of this?
Yeah, look, it's interesting because the week of the George Floyd murder, there was that Friday afternoon when I kind of felt something building, and that night obviously is when we
Yeah.
had some real, mass protests around the country. That afternoon, I was on the phone with some people who work with coaches in various capacities, whether that's, through their agencies or, through kind of the PR people they work with, and, personally, and people who, help build their brands and all that stuff. And there was this real hesitation about coaches saying something, about coaches, this is one they didn't want to touch, and I just said to some of these people, like, you're going to look back on this by the end of the weekend, and you're going to, if you're not saying something, you're going to be looked at as way behind, because this is different. There's something happening here that you need to be in the middle of. And I think I was right about that. And so it's been interesting to see the coach, how the coaches sort of went from, like just Will Muschamp as an example.
Yeah.
3 years ago, you ask him about, the election or whatever. I mean, and he doesn't want to say anything, far away from it as possible. And now all of a sudden he's out, marching in a protest with his players. And so there's an evolution there, but that's part of coaching. Like it's not just the X's and O's on the football field. It's about, how you connect with your team. And I think if you're a coach in 2020 and you can't engage your players on that level, then you're not connecting with your team in a way that's authentic and in a way that they're going to respond to on the field, because they need that buy-in. They need to know the coach is interested in what's going on in their lives. And so I just think it's important. And I think most of the coaches have done a pretty good job of responding to it.
It's difficult to not be a columnist and not to be obviously called out on things. And I'd be remiss not to mention, obviously, you've gone at it with people on Twitter. People have gone after you on Twitter. I know people try to call you Dan Woke and all that stuff. You seem to handle it in stride, and you stick to your guns and aren't afraid to kind of mix it up with the fans. And especially here lately, during the coronavirus pandemic, where there's just there seems to be like no middle ground with it. Everybody's just like, oh, let's just go on and do this, go on with our life. It's not this, it's not that. And then the other side where it's based in science and everything. But not to get to political, but it is political. It's become political. And in dealing with these fans, what has been the most difficult thing about it? Is it just people just aren't willing to change their opinion?
I mean, I don't want to say difficult. Look, whenever you are a columnist, whenever you are giving a lot of opinions, putting them in writing, whether that's in a newspaper format or on Twitter, you're going to get blowback. You kind of know what the reaction to something is going to be, and there's going to be a group of people who is going to disagree with you and call you out. I can't spend all day long dealing with trolls or people online. I mean, I will respond to some every now and then, but I think the most ridiculous thing that's come out of all this is this narrative that the people that, not just me, but other people in the sports media, are rooting against sports.
Yeah,
you don't want
that's weird.
You don't want sports to come back. You're rooting. Why are you rooting against sports? And that could not be further from the truth. But when you are in this position that I'm in, I'm trying to be informative. I'm trying to look at things from all kinds of directions and be factual, or at least try to understand the facts as best as I can. And this started from the very beginning. I mean, this started when I was the first one to write a column saying, is the NCAA tournament in big trouble here? And is it really appropriate to play the NCAA tournament? And I got incredible blowback on that. And then 48 hours later, the NCAA tournament was canceled. It wasn't because I wanted it to happen. It's because I was consuming news and events, and the fact that at that time, we had senators who were going into quarantine, U.S. senators, because they'd been in contact at a convention with somebody who tested positive. And at that point, I mean, that's what we're doing. And I'm sitting there trying to think through it. All right, we're about to play an NCAA tournament and have 68 teams fly in from all over the country to go to these sites, and fans. And, what are the odds that everyone is going to be negative of coronavirus? Probably really, really small. So then what happens if you have a positive test, someone gets sick? What do you do? And no one could really answer that question, right? I mean, just the timing of it, we didn't know. And so I've tried to approach it as just, all right, this is a brand new thing in our lives that we've never dealt with. We don't know how to handle it. We don't know. The scientists don't even really know for sure why it makes some people really, really sick and why some people have no symptoms at all. And obviously people talk about the death rate, and the death rate isn't a factor in how you deal with this. But there's a lot of other outcomes of this that are occurring that are not death, that are severe, that are potentially scary. We don't know what the long-term effects are to the lungs. It's a respiratory disease. So my job, as I see it, is just to ask questions and to raise issues and to make sure people are making good decisions, to try to hold people making decisions accountable. Because if you just, like the SEC, the NCAA, these are entities that will cut corners to get their product out and play it. And we've already seen it with the SEC. They have not had a policy saying that you have to test all these athletes coming back to campus for workouts. Well, we just saw yesterday, Houston had to shut down their off-season program because they had a bunch of positive tests. Some were symptomatic, apparently. They didn't test athletes coming back. So that's why you raise these issues, and you force people to have an answer and a plan, and you hold them accountable for it. It's not that you're rooting against sports, but I do think it's important that someone is there to put a check on people and make them give you some answers.
I know Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott, he wants some type of universal testing policy when they get to the regular season. Are we going to be able to get to that point among the Power Five, the Autonomy Five, let alone trying to filter that down to the Group of Five and other schools?
Well, I think what you'll end up having is you'll have policies that probably look and function in a similar way, but there may be differences in them, from conference to conference. From what I've heard, I mean, there are some conferences who are further along than others on the specifics, but, generally speaking, you're probably going to see some copycatting, of that, but there's still a lot of issues to work out. What day is the test pregame? That's a big issue. I mean, there's going to be almost certainly everyone's got to get tested before you get on the field Thursday, Friday, depending on how quickly you can get those results. And, it's just going to be interesting to see. I mean, there are going to be teams almost certainly that have, entire position groups pretty much that are all positive.
Yeah.
Some of the star players, somebody's starting quarterback. Maybe a team has so many positives that they can't make the trip. But what is that threshold? And then who's, uh, once you get those test results, how do you inform your opponent about how many positives? Do you make an announcement to the public? Like, these are all things that are, in this context of the coronavirus, I think are important procedural items to have in hand before the season starts. And we're not there yet. And, we're just, there is going to be some trial and error in all this.
Yeah. I mean, it isn't like the NFL where we get an injury report every week, and that's simple.
Right.
Now we're asking college to not only do kind of an injury report, but which players are, sick, when do they test, how long have they been in quarantine, why are they allowed back on the field, why are they playing in this game? Then there's also the other issue, contact tracing is so important in all of this, but let's say your starting quarterback gets sick, and then you're in the process of contact tracing, and that might take a day or two, and then you're in game week, and you end up accidentally, without knowing, playing a player that was maybe exposed that you weren't accounting for, and they're asymptomatic at that moment, and then they infect 3 players on the other field on the field. It's
very complicated. It's why college football is going to be so hard to manage the season. And it's one sport you cannot put in a bubble.
right.
Even in the NFL, which you've not heard any talk of any sort of bubble concept in the NFL, but even then, you're sort of relying on players to, they show up, they go to work, they go home. It doesn't mean you're not going to have positive tests, but I think generally speaking, the idea is those guys are going to want to limit their exposure. With college athletes, I think the idea that guys are going to, just kind of go to the facility and go back to their apartment and stay there for, 18 hours a day, that's not going to happen. So yeah, I think college football is by far the hardest sport to bring back.
Do we have an on-time start to the season? What do you think?
I mean, look, I think there's a good chance of it, but you have more situations like Houston right now, and and then obviously there's going to be a totally different layer to this once you start practice and you start contact and that kind of thing. So if you get to July and teams start practicing and you start hearing about this team had to shut down for a week and that team had to shut down for a week, and I mean, then you're really in some jeopardy of who knows, and that's why. Look, I'm not advocating that this is what they should do, but just intellectually, it's why the whole idea of just moving everything to January makes some sense, in the sense that it's just buying more time to refine your procedures, to potentially, have the hope of a therapeutic or, vaccine trials that you're promising or whatever it is. Just understanding more about the virus, like you just give yourself those extra 4 months, that are potentially valuable. I'm not saying that's what they should do, and I don't think that's what they're going to do. But I certainly, if somebody who's like a czar of college football said, listen, this is not going to happen. It's too fast. We just don't have this down yet. We need to work on this more. We're going to start January 1st. I totally would understand that, and I think it would intellectually make sense.
It almost feels like, I mean, because a lot of conferences, even when it comes to smaller things like media days, which really don't matter, they're trying to wait till the last minute to make these decisions, especially the SEC. It almost feels like we're getting a situation where we're going to get to mid-August and then they're going to decide, okay, maybe we start on time, or no, we're not going to be able to play our first game of the season, or we're not going to play this team. We're going to have to reschedule something. They're going to wait to the last minute, because I think for a lot of these conferences, especially the Autonomy 5, they're going to do their damnedest to play as many games as possible. And does that mean they start and restart it? Not restart season, but to come back to the season? I think that's possible. I know a lot of people say you can't do that, but I think they would.
Look, I've said this to a bunch of people, and I've said it publicly a little bit. For this year, wins and losses are not that important. It's just not, and I think everyone's going to kind of have to get into that mindset. Now, obviously, coaches don't want their players in that mindset, and I'm not trying to suggest that, but just from a global standpoint, the goal for college football season is playing as many games as possible and doing it safely, and just from a cold, crass financial perspective, to make as much money as they can, because this is going to be a very difficult situation for all these schools to deal with. So, if you have to pause the season, if you have to forfeit a game, if we get to October and it's not looking good and they say, all right, we're gonna stop for a month and come back, like, those things are all going to be really inconvenient and not a lot of fun, but it's whatever they have to do to make this thing happen. You need to keep every option open.
What do you think is the number one thing when you speak to administrators that really sticks out to you, as far as whether it's a good thing or a bad thing in their handling of the entire situation, where you're just going, okay, that approach seems like it could work, or that approach seems to be damned from the moment you put it in place, and you're just, it's bound to fail sooner than later? I mean, and you look at it from the simplest terms of step one, like at Houston, not testing all athletes, and look where you're at. And then some, obviously like Houston too, only testing symptomatic. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, at least from my standpoint, if you're bringing everybody into this, into workouts. But even beyond that, what are some of the ideas you've heard that are just completely out there, whether they're good or bad?
Well, I think one thing that's kind of interesting, and this is not necessarily just a college football thing, but more of a football generally thing, is is there a way to build a helmet so that that people aren't breathing on each other as much? That I think would be worthwhile. Because you're just the thing that I've sort of understood about the virus is just you're never going to have anything perfect, but it's just how many different layers of protection of diminishing the percent chance. And if you can put one measure in that diminishes at 50%, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, well, then you have a good chance of containing it, right? So helmets, I think, are key. The issue I'm hung up on right now, there's two things. One is coaches. What is that going to look like? Coaches. There's a lot of coaches who are older. There's a lot of coaches who have pre-existing conditions. A lot of coaches. I mean, people who've been through cancer treatments and heart disease and all this kind of stuff. Like, you don't want them getting COVID, and how are they going to function? In that environment around all these guys, and how well are you taking care of them and making sure that they're they're not putting themselves at risk? And then the other thing is just the fans. Like, the idea that we're going to have full stadiums, to me, is just insane. I just don't see how it's possible. Because, these college campuses, when on a game day, they turn into sort of mini metropolises. When you're at an Auburn or an Alabama, they're pulling people in, very small numbers of people who live in those towns. Right. They're pulling people in from Birmingham and from, Atlanta and Nashville, and, so they're pulling in.
Those cities become the largest cities in that state for that day. It happens in a lot of places.
Right. And you're pulling in all these different people from all over the region. They're coming there and then they're going back.
Yeah.
To me, that's just that's a super spreader event, and the other thing is there's no way to, if you have full stadiums, I know we're talking about being outside and that being outside is better than inside.
Right.
Totally buy it. Right. But you've been, and any sports writer, who's had to get from a press box to the field after a game. How many people are you touching, pushing out of the way, breathing on, all that kind of stuff, running into? Like, it's a massive humanity. And even though it's outside, like, there's no way that many people crowded in when you're talking about getting into the stadium, leaving the stadium, concession stands, yelling during the game. Like, they will, it's a very high risk activity. I mean, you've seen epidemiologists talk about going to a sporting event for them personally would be the last thing they would do in terms of returning to normal activity. So
yeah.
I think there's a lot of delusion going on. I mean, even in the state of Texas, I wrote a story last night that the governor of the state had a meeting with the athletic directors of the 12 FBS schools yesterday and just told them, don't count on. He said, I've said 50% capacity. Don't count on it being any more than that, unless there's something drastically changes. And even after that, I saw the Texas A&M athletic director quoted today that, there's time's on our side, and like,
That's a thing. That's a common thing you're hearing from SEC administrators, and it comes from the top down. It's that they have a long runway, that they're going to wait till the last minute to do a lot of these decisions.
It's not that long. It's 2 months.
Yeah.
That's not that long of a time. And Texas is a state where, I mean, the epidemic seems to be, rising instead of receding. The numbers aren't great in Florida. They're not great in Alabama. So I don't think if you're a school, you want a football game to be responsible for outbreaks across your state. I think that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So we'll see. But I think there's a lot of delusion about the attendance issue. I really do.
Yeah, I don't see. I mean, just based off of the studies we've seen about, everybody assumes 6 feet apart and all this, but I've seen other things about, 36, 35 square feet, which takes up rows. And then you got to figure out, like, if you're with a group of people and your wife, people that you've been in the same house with, and then you're able to sit together. But then that expands that circle or whatever. Or if you have a single season ticket holder sitting somewhere, that takes up more space. So it's not necessarily like, hey, we're just going to let 40,000 people in. It's going to be like, well, it's actually like 36,422 because of the groupings and everything. There's a lot of logistics and math that's going to have to go into this whole situation. A lot of planning. And, and look, I feel for everyone in this situation, like these athletic directors, these administrators. I mean, ever since the middle of March, they've never worked harder in their lives, in terms of the amount of time they've had to spend dealing with all of these issues. Right. I get it. And this is, just getting players back for individual workouts logistically has been a massive undertaking. And I can only imagine that if you have to cap your capacity, whatever it is, half, third, quarter, whatever it is, I mean, you're dealing with, how do you choose? You're dealing with how do you space the stadium, where people are actually seating, in and out procedures and all that stuff. It's a nightmare. But I just think for this year, it's almost certainly what's going to have to be done. Yep. Dan Wolken with USA Today national columnist. Check him out, usatoday.com, of course, and on Twitter. Dan, thank you so much for joining us on 24/7 Sports' Social Distance.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks, Brandon.